All right, last part of your notes for Unit 3 focuses on a process called fermentation. We should have just got through talking about cellular respiration. We see this as the production of ATP from the breakdown of food molecules, right? Carbon-based molecules, whatever we took in for that energy source. If it's animals, it's what we ate. If it's plants, it's what was produced during photosynthesis. But however, there's sometimes, though, that we need energy and we don't have all the things that are required, all the reactants that are required for cellular respiration. Think about if you've ever had to, run more than just a quick sprint. You kind of start getting tired, right? You start needing to breathe harder and trying to get more and more oxygen, but you still get very winded. And that's because you're not able to take in enough oxygen for cellular respiration to continue at the rate that it does to make that amount of ATP that we saw in the end, okay? This is where a process called fermentation takes place inside of our muscles as animals. This also happens in some other things that we'll look at. What fermentation does is it allows glycolysis to continue. If you remember, glycolysis is that first stage of cellular respiration. It's what happens in the cytoplasm of the cell before it even gets in the mitochondria, and that glucose, the simple sugars, are broken down into that pyruvate. Okay, so now we got this pyruvate. And if you remember, one key thing was 2 ATP are made during glycolysis. Of course, that's not near the amount that we want to be made. That's going to happen in cellular respiration, but we still get that little burst of energy. Okay, we still have that molecule that carries the energy. Fermentation allows glycolysis to continue making ATP when oxygen is unavailable. If you remember cellular respiration, one of the reactants is O2. Okay, so it's oxygen. Think about it this way. Glycolysis occurs even without oxygen, whatever, it doesn't need it at that moment, and it makes 2 ATP. If there's oxygen available, boom, we're going to keep going through cellular respiration and hopefully get a good amount of energy, from those molecules that now we've broken down, the glucose. If oxygen is unavailable, or say not in the quantities that we need because you're tired from running, fermentation is what's going to begin to occur inside those cells. It's an anaerobic process. And anaerobic, just like aerobic, means requiring oxygen, or oxygen is needed for it to occur. This says it can happen without oxygen, okay? An means without. So anaerobic, without oxygen process. So if oxygen isn't available, fermentation is what begins to occur. This does not produce ATP like it does in the long run. It produces that very short burst, or that small quantity of ATP that we see in glycolysis. What fermentation does, however, is it makes a molecule called NAD plus that is recycled over and over again to make glycolysis occur. And that produces that 2 ATP in that process of glycolysis. Fermentation makes this molecule that allows glycolysis to restart. We get 2 ATP, and the cycle continues and continues. We're going to see a graph here in a minute. So there's 2 different types of fermentation that we need to know about. One is lactic acid fermentation, and this occurs in muscle cells. Why does your muscles get that tired feeling? Why do you get that stitch in your side if you're running? You get that burning if you lifted a bunch of weights, and the muscles, they're not necessarily sore, it's just that burn. This is lactic acid buildup, okay? Lactic acid is a byproduct of this fermentation process. So check out this chart with me. We have glycolysis, okay? It's going to split that glucose that we got from eating things, or the plant even made from photosynthesis. But with lactic acid, we're talking about animals. So that glucose, it is broken down during the process of glycolysis, making these 2 pyruvate. We also learned that 2 ATP is made. At the same time, this molecule called NAD plus is converted into a molecule called NADH. Okay, some of the hydrogens from the glucose gets broken down and added on here. All right, so it becomes this molecule. Now, from this point, if it was cellular respiration, boom, it goes on to cellular respiration. Oxygen is present. We see the end results being a heap and helping of ATP. However, oxygen is not available, so it goes through this lactic acid fermentation. Okay, so we got the 2 pyruvate coming in. We got the NADH coming in. During this process, notice no ATP is made. Okay, no ATP is made. That's happened during glycolysis. That's the energy. This pyruvate turns into a substance called lactic acid. And it's because we're removing certain parts of it to convert NADH back to NAD+. All right? So when that occurs, this NADH or NAD+ goes back to that process. You can't really see it because of my little tablet here, but you got it on yours. It goes back into that whole process of glycolysis again. So the NAD plus comes with the glucose that we've still gotten from whatever food we've eaten. Still no oxygens needing to be present. This starts over. We get some ATP from it, just 2 of them. All the extra stuff moves into fermentation again. We still get this lactic acid that aches and burns in our muscles. But this whole process just goes on and on and on. Meanwhile, how are we still be able to run? How are we able to still working out? How are we still able to do anything? We're still getting those 2 molecules of ATP the whole while. So you can see it's certainly not as efficient as cellular respiration, not at all, but it comes through in the clutch, right? If we don't have the oxygen to make cellular respiration occur, this is what happens. And this is just going through the extra steps. Energy from NADH converts into pyruvate, which then turns into lactic acid. And the NADH is changed back into NAD+. Okay? I'll leave it there for a minute. I got a little ahead of myself looking at the graph. But I love this chart, how it shows us how glycolysis is the one making the ATP molecules. But instead of going from then to cellular respiration, it just goes through this process where oxygen isn't needed. And bringing us back to that whole glycolysis over and over and over again. Meanwhile, we're making this lactic acid. We start to burn in our muscles, but we still have energy to do what we need to do. Of course, with time and lots of effort, you can become a marathon runner because your body becomes more efficient at this whole process, and also the process of cellular respiration. It needs actually less oxygen the more in shape you get, if you want to think of it that way. There's another type of fermentation, and that's called alcoholic fermentation. And just as the name implies, it kind of produces this alcohol-type substance. It's similar to lactic acid, but it's kind of different because of the different things it shows up in. We are able to take the products from alcoholic fermentation and make things like cheeses and breads and yogurt. Yeast, if you've ever heard of that, goes through this alcoholic process. So that's how we're able to make certain types of breads. And, of course, as the name implies, certain types of alcohols with that too. In this, though, glycolysis, very much like you saw in lactic acid fermentation, glycolysis splits glucose. So there it is, there in glycolysis, glucose splits in these pyruvate. The NAD plus is converted to NADH. Here's where the energy comes from. But then when we move, no oxygen is available, or in less quantities at least. It goes through this type of fermentation. So instead of over here having lactic acid, we have 2 alcohol molecules and this carbon dioxide that's released. If you've ever seen bread rise, it starts plumping up, and it's mainly because this carbon dioxide is released, leaving these little bubbles. Or if you've ever seen the process of alcohol made from grains being made, there's lots of bubbles, and that's the CO2 releasing. Meanwhile, alcohol is being made, and the CO2 gas is let off. This is very similar, just as we saw in lactic acid fermentation. NAD plus becomes NADH, which then during fermentation, it converts back to it. And then if my little tab thing here wasn't in the way, we'd see it goes back into glycolysis. And the whole process goes over and over again. In short, here that is written out. That's just what I said. There's for your notes. In short, these fermentation processes allows glycolysis, that first step before cellular respiration occurs, to continue over and over and over and over again. So it's breaking down the glucose into some other things, but also a small amount of ATP, or those energy carrying molecules. Of course, if we need more energy, cellular respiration is the way to get it, but oxygen is not always available. So lactic acid fermentation allows us to be able to still carry out athletic activities or movements. And then also we see that people have been smart enough to use this scientific process to make products such as cheeses and breads and alcohol. Okay, so there you have it, NADH back to NADP, or NAD plus, and then it's recycled in glycolysis. All right, we won't worry too much about that. We can look at it. Just a few notes. Basically, it's telling you the same thing. This isn't in your notes, but cells contain only enough ATP for a few seconds of intense activity, so a quick sprint. But if we're running, a couple laps around the football field, our body's going to start going through lactic acid fermentation. Now, it's still doing cellular respiration at the same time, but it's requiring more energy. So the oxygen you're taking in is not enough. Okay, it's not good enough. That's why you're breathing hard. But as your body trains, you'll be able to more efficiently use that oxygen. But we still need to be able to move. That's why this lactic acid fermentation is able to set up. It causes burning in the muscles. And the only really way to get rid of lactic acid or that burn is a chemical pathway that requires oxygen. So you breathe heavy. You got your hands on your head, or you're trying to lean over on your knees, and you're trying to take in all that oxygen you can, and eventually those pains will go away. And it's not because the muscles are not sore anymore. It's because the lactic acid is broken down. Okay, your body's gone out of that kind of emergency backup supply. That's pretty much it. It's just some things about athletics. So get your notes filled in. We'll briefly talk about this next week in class. There'll be some questions on your exam and your review and all that good stuff. So just be familiar with these notes and mainly the process of fermentation, just the big overall scheme of it, why it's important and that good stuff. Email me if you got questions.